we didn't have the inhibitions of an older, cautious person who is worried what the neighbors think of him. Does anybody get anything by being called respectable? Because usually that's the opposite of respectable. Usually it is a lack of self belief in the opinion you have because you think it's not important enough to get upset about. It's not important enough to lose something over. It's just if I say something in a meek voice, maybe they'll eventually see that I'm right. No, that's not how the world works. They hated us, but we were relevant.
Throughout history, whenever great injustices existed, youth movements have risen up to combat and end those injustices.
You have organizations out there like the Center for Bioethical Reform,
the Center for Bioethical Reform,
Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform,
organizations like the Center for Bioethical Reform to receive public funds when they then use to attack a woman's right to choose.
Abortion kills all kinds of people, so then all kinds of people can join the pro-life movement to save these babies.
I was talking to a young man on the streets of Toronto.
I spoke with a woman named Lucy about abortion.
Today we were doing Choice Chain in downtown Regina.
By the end of the conversation, she was completely pro-life.
He then walked away 100% pro-life.
Completely pro-life.
We should remember that each of those babies that die every day in Canada not only have the right to life that's being violated, they also have the right to our defense.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pro-Life Guys podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. That opening quote is a phenomenal quote found in Jonathon Van Maren's recent book, Patriots, the Untold Story of Ireland's Pro-Life Movement. And that is a quote by an activist who fought tooth and nail, fought against abortion supporters trying to get rid of the Eighth Amendment, and continues to fight today. And there's something really, really important about that. I love the mentality that many people have is if I just say something meekly, the truth is going to come out and it's going to stand. And the mentality that youth defense, we'll talk about youth defense later, and the Irish pro-life activists had was, this is not the way the world works. We need to get out there. We need to bring the truth about abortion to the streets. We need to make sure that people know precisely what abortion is. And the media hated them. So many other people hated them, but they were relevant. Anyway, we're going to get into that a little bit more. For those of you who are new to the program, thank you again. We are two guys who are passionate about ending the killing of preborn children here in Canada. And this podcast is dedicated to giving you the tools that you need to change minds and save lives from abortion. We take to the streets, we have conversations with people time and time again, and we want to share with you some of the things that we have learned. But today, it's the focus is going to be a little bit different as we have a conversation about what we can learn from the Irish pro-life movement. Before we get there, my name is Peter. I'm the host of the show, and again, I'm joined by Cameron Cote, who I neglected to introduce until this point. My apologies, sir.
No worries, Peter. It is an odd time here in Calgary. Not only, obviously, do we still have COVID restrictions that are causing us to amend and adapt our outreach projects, but also we're in the middle of a polar vortex. It feels like minus 40 outside. Hence, we are taking a brief pause from activism. That said, though, I am really excited about today's interview because something that I hear on the street constantly is this idea that a nation simply cannot function in the 21st century unless they wholeheartedly embrace abortion. That mothers and mothers, are going to be dying left, right, and center through back alley abortions. Maternal health care can be absolutely terrible if abortion is not accepted. And yet today we're going to talk to some pretty cool people, especially Niamh, who is going to share a little bit about the Irish pro-life movement and how for 35 years, not only did they survive in this 20th and 21st century, but also they thrived, having one of the lowest maternal mortality rates in the world. And through their restriction on abortion, saved over 250,000 lives during that 35-year span. I'm pretty excited. Not only that, we also got some pretty cool news coming up, Peter. One of the other things that you and I are both working on is prepping for our first Ask Me Anything, which we're planning on holding on Friday, March 5th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. whatever time zone you're in, you can adapt it from the Eastern Standard Time from Toronto, because we all know the world revolves around Toronto. But yeah, we're excited to do this Ask Me Anything. It'll be an open Zoom call in which anyone who is a Patreon supporter, as long as you've registered as a patron by Friday, February 26th of this year, you will be invited to join us for this open evening, whether it's 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. We're going to keep talking until you're tired and you guys leave, or you run out of questions or something like that. And so if you want to join us for our first ever Ask Me Anything on Friday, March 5th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, please sign up, register as a Patreon. We'll put all that info in the show notes by Friday, February 26th. I'm excited for that, Peter. I don't know if you are, but I know that I certainly am.
No, I am. We have a few people who are supporting us already, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with them, seeing what sort of questions they have, and just kind of, discussing it all together. One other thing as well before I get into the introductions, we are giving away a signed copy of Jonathan's book, which we're going to talk about, Patriots, The Untold Story of Ireland's Pro-Life Movement by Jonathon Van Maren. He will sign it, and we will be giving one of those copies away. Stay tuned. We're going to share a little bit more about that at the end of the conversation. So let me introduce our guests. We have two guests today. One is Niamh Uí Bhriain, and the second is Jonathon Van Maren. Niamh is an Irish anti-abortion activist who has been active in the fight since 1992. She co-founded Youth Defence, which is Ireland's largest and most active pro-life organization that campaigns all over the nation to defend and protect preborn children. Niamh fought tirelessly as abortion activists sought to remove the Eighth Amendment that protected both the mother's life, the mother and her preborn child, and now campaigns for preborn children with the Life Institute. She is also a commentator for Gript, which you can find at gript.ie, gript.ie. Our second guest is Jonathon Van Maren, the author of Patriots. And Jonathon is a columnist, author, public speaker, and pro-life activist. He holds a BA in history from the Simon Fraser University and is CCBR's communications director, CCBR being the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. His previous books include The Culture War, Seeing is Believing, and A Guide to Discussing Assisted Suicide, which is co-authored by our colleague Blaise Allain. His work has appeared in the National Review, the National Post, and elsewhere. And if you want to find his blog, you can check him out at thebridgehead.ca, thebridgehead.ca. So the reason we're having both Jonathon and Niamh on to have this conversation is because Niamh was there. Niamh has the experience. She was the one that fought on the ground, on the streets, rallying the troops, pressuring politicians, going and shaping the culture. She was there on the streets and has the firsthand experience. And then Jonathon wrote this book about the history of the pro-life movement, the Irish pro-life movement, and he has done an extensive amount of research into everything surrounding that. So he wanted to bring both of them on to talk about their experiences, talk about the research they've done, and what they know about the Irish pro-life movement, about the Eighth Amendment, which protected preborn children in the womb, and about that whole entire story. This is a fascinating and a riveting story. We hope you stick with it to the end. It's the longest conversation we've had so far, but it is very, very, very well worth listening to. So here it is. We hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did. Niamh, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us.
Very welcome. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, and Jonathon, thank you. Thank you for coming back, my friend.
Yeah, you bet.
All right. Niamh, before we get into your story, the work that you did fighting abortion in Ireland, we thought it'd be important to set the stage for where we are in the context of Ireland. So what we want to do is talk about the inception of the Eighth Amendment, this really revolutionary amendment that protected hundreds of thousands of preborn children. So I guess this is for both you and Jonathon, but Niamh, perhaps you could start with this. How did the Eighth Amendment come to be in Ireland?
So the Eighth Amendment came to be, in summary, if you like, because people who are working or who people who are interested in this issue in Ireland, pro-life people, ordinary people, saw what was happening in other countries. So they saw what had happened in the US, they saw what had happened in England, how the right to privacy or other rights could be interpreted as meaning that there was a legal right to abortion. And the Irish Constitution didn't also had a right to privacy. And the people got together and lobbied and worked and campaigned, and they were incredible people. Back in 1983, one of the arguments used against inserting the amendment into the Constitution was that people, even though they knew themselves, that they didn't believe it themselves, but they scoffed at the notion that anyone would try to legalise abortion in Ireland. So it was like, we don't need this amendment. It's never going to happen here. Just because it happened in Britain or in America, it's never going to happen here. But there were the same people, of course, who did want it to happen here. And that's why they wanted a no vote at the time. But the amendment, and the people who worked on that campaign, some of them were still involved in the movement, for the next 30 years, right up to the vote in 2018. But they were really prescient, in what they understood would happen if you didn't have this constitutional amendment to protect the unborn child. And so it was put to the people in a referendum in 1983 and was passed by a 2/3 majority, huge majority. And the unborn children and their mothers had an equal right to life, and they were both protected, because it's often said of Ireland, oh, you had an anti-abortion law, but it was more than that. It was a clause which protected the right to life of both mother and child. And one of the most amazing things about that was that Ireland became, if you like, a case. If you looked at Ireland's experience, it was like a natural experiment in how pro-life laws actually work, because we had excellent maternal mortality rates here in Ireland. We're one of the safest places in the world for a woman to have a baby. And at the same time, our law protected the right to life of the unborn child. And as you said, Peter, hundreds of thousands of babies were saved by that law. If you look, and people have ran the numbers on this, actuaries and statisticians, and if you look at what happened in other countries, and if you look even what's happening in Ireland now, the way the abortion rate has shot up, literally anything from between 100,000 to 250,000 children's lives were spared because of the Eighth Amendment. And that's a tremendous achievement.
Yeah, that most certainly is. But talking about other countries, it's important to note here that Ireland was really an anomaly when it comes to some of these other Western nations. We see other Western nations pushing for contraception, for abortion, for really just being more enlightened, which basically means less human rights for preborn children. And so, Jonathon, you've researched extensively into the sexual revolution, into the history of abortion in the West. What was different about Ireland?
Well, the first thing, of course, is what Niamh mentioned, which was their prescience. I actually think that if more countries had successfully done what Ireland did with the Eighth, there would be many countries in the West that might have lasted as long as Ireland did, the United States actually being one of them. And that prescience saved, as Niamh pointed out, hundreds of thousands of lives. The second point that I think is necessary for listeners to understand is that there's this basic assumption promoted by the media that the reality of what took place on the ground was that the Eighth Amendment was just sort of a hangover from Ireland's medieval past, and that now she was throwing off her Catholic yoke, and that this is just sort of the natural way things unfolded, when in reality, the story of how the Eighth Amendment was implemented is a fascinating one that every pro-life activist interested in strategy should study, because it has a very, very comprehensive on-the-ground element as well as a political lobbyist element. And one of the things I'm frequently frustrated by is the antagonism between the political wing that says, look, we have to do things, very, very, very with keeping PR in mind. We have to do things very properly. And then they kind of sneer at the grassroots wing, who will be doing, what we do with abortion victim photography, or, having the rallies and generally being more rabble-rousers. And the campaign to achieve the Eighth, I think, perfectly showed that both of these arms are necessary, that you had lawyers, barristers, you had all of these incredible political strategists that were walking the halls and were actually speaking to politicians and were ensuring that the right wording was found, and they were negotiating with different politicians. And then you had SPUC, Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, and thousands of just ordinary people who were genuinely offended by the idea of abortion, who were on the ground ensuring that the average members of the public understood what was at stake and why they needed to get out there and vote. And those two arms together produced the Eighth Amendment. And together, the grassroots arm and the political arm deserve the credit as a unified movement for those hundreds of thousands of babies that got saved. So that's something I think that we need to take away from it.
Yeah.
The reason it's particularly relevant right now, I think, again, with prevention is look what just happened in Argentina. And then we'll look what happened, as you guys discussed on your podcast last week, in Honduras. Honduras looked at Argentina and said, wait, they're going to bribe a handful of senators. They're going to ramrod it through here. So what we need to do is create a constitutional amendment to make it almost impossible to remove it. And now there are other Latin American nations that are considering the same thing. And Ireland was the first one to do this, but it's a very relevant example because there are other nations that could be doing exactly the same thing and could save hundreds of thousands of babies as a result.
One of the things Jonathan Jonathan's book, Patriots, about the pro-life movement in Ireland, about the Eighth Amendment, and then what happened afterwards is brilliant. And, I remember reading it and thinking, this is all the history I thought I knew, but he's actually discovered kind of so much or reminded me of so much. And it's a fascinating, extremely well written. And one of the things he did remind me of was that, people think, 1983 Ireland was a very Catholic country. This is what people assume. And, the passage of the Eighth Amendment would have been easy, but that actually wasn't the case. And he is completely correct. You had this huge grassroots movement made up of ordinary people who really did not want Ireland to become like other countries in Europe or throughout the world, where you're looking at these like ever increasing abortion rates, the sadness associated with all of that. And they then worked, to put pressure on politicians to accept what the campaign group was offering in terms of the Eighth Amendment and the wording of the Eighth Amendment, because there was resistance and kickback from politicians at the time in 1983. Like, the country was starting to open up and become more liberal, become more progressive, to use their word, even though I can't ever imagine what they imagine is progressive on killing an innocent child, But there was definitely kickback and a fight that happened in 1983. But what I suppose the big thing the pro-life movement had going for it was that the majority of people were very adamant in their opposition to abortion, and the politicians were forced to listen to them and were forced to do the bit to put the matter to a referendum so that people could vote on it. And that was tremendously important. And I think it's what Jonathan is highlighting there is a message for all of us that, grassroots movements can bring about change, even against all the odds. Like, the media in 1983 were totally against the Eighth Amendment. They were in the same way that they've been in favor of abortion ever since. Like, they ran editorials opposing it. They warned. They said that if we put the Eighth Amendment into the Constitution, that women would die. It was a lot of the same scaremongering that unfortunately worked in 2018. So it wasn't the case that it was an easy victory for pro-lifers in 83. It was difficult. It was hard won, but it was won, and it saved all those lives. And I think you're totally right, Jonathan. You're looking at people in countries like Honduras, and they're leading the way now. They're saying, let's get this protection into the Constitution so it can't be overturned by the legislature. It has to be something that the people decide.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Jonathan, you mentioned that, and like you said, Niamh, the grassroots are so vital. And when you look at what was happening around, you look at the UK, I believe, legalized abortion in 1967, America in 1973, Canada first in 69, and then again in 88. You see all of this stuff happening around Ireland, and yet the people of Ireland remaining steadfast. And I wonder, Niamh, I'm sure this is a big question to ask, and asking about kind of the nature of Irish culture and whatnot. But when I look at Canada, and I am certainly not the best read person out there, and Jonathan, you might correct me on this, but when I look at Canada and how we interact on an international stage, I'm often reminded of the annoying younger brother, where we look at everyone around us, we look at America, we look at Europe, we look at all these other countries, and we're just trying to impress them. We're just trying to do something either before they did it, or we try to mimic whatever's happening south of the border. Toronto desperately wants to be New York. The rest of Canada desperately wants to be Toronto. We just want to fit in. All we want in Canada is to fit in. And yet, I think it's a very different story from my understanding of Ireland, that it's not a matter of trying to fit in with the UK. It's not a matter of trying to impress the people around you, but rather a unique and very well-defined identity, I guess. And I know that as we'll get into as this develops, this has changed in recent years. But could you speak a little bit to the long-held identity of the Irish people and how this may have built into the grassroots movement of putting in the Eighth Amendment?
Well, I think that Ireland did have a strong sense of being a people to whom certain values and the culture and the faith and that were part of what shaped who we were, and I think that came under enormous attack, and that certainly a lot of that has gone from Irish society and how we see ourselves, and that just like what you're saying about Canada, there was a lot of people in Ireland, especially the people like the elites, the political and media elites, who were embarrassed by what they saw as Ireland's excessive Catholicism, if you like, and they were embarrassed by things like the Eighth Amendment. And when the European Parliament or the United Nations or other countries looked to Ireland's abortion laws and said unfairly and incorrectly that they were a breach of human rights, everything like that embarrassed progressives and liberals and the elite in Ireland. But it wasn't just an inward change or an internal change. You had like incredibly powerful organizations, like say the Center for Reproductive Rights in the United States. These are people who raise money, enormous sums of money. Like we could never compete with this kind of thing. From foundations, from Bank of America, from the Ford Foundation, these very rich organizations, and they actually organise the strategy and the court cases to attack the Eighth Amendment and to undermine Ireland's abortion law. So when you read about, Ireland being taken to the United Nations, that was the Centre for Reproductive Rights. It wasn't an Irish organisation who organised those court cases. And then, of course, they generate international and national headlines, saying that Ireland's laws had to change, that they're barbaric and backward, when in fact, of course, they're progressive and humane. But everything, I think the culture was changing. And the culture was changing in regard to many things. And Jonathan and I had this conversation about this, that even though Irish people have become very liberal on many issues, on the abortion issue, it was a line in the sand they didn't want to cross. And right up to 2012, at the time, Enda Kenny was Taoiseach here, and he was interviewed by Time magazine, and he was, Man of the Year. I think he made the cover. It was a big deal. It was a big deal for him, anyway. And they asked him. There had been a European Court of Human Rights ruling saying that Ireland needed to legalise abortion, and they asked him about it, and he said, "It's not going to happen because it's not what the people want." And Enda Kenny was famous for governing by opinion poll. That's what he became most famous for, because everything he did, he polled on it. And he had done his polling, and he knew, like everybody knew from the opinion polls, that while Irish people, they might have wavered a bit and they might want abortion legalised in some circumstances, in general, they didn't want to be like other countries. They thought abortion laws were too permissive and excessive there. And they would rather stay with the status quo than adopt a liberal abortion law. But then in 2012, the Savita Halappanavar case blew all of that out of the water.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that case shortly.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get there, so for Cam and I, who have never known a home where preborn children were protected,
Mm-hmm.
Jonathan's significantly older than us, so he might. But it's always been countercultural for us to be pro-life, and so I'm curious, what was it like? What was it like growing up? I mean, what was this position that the Eighth Amendment was good? Was that taught in school? How was it taught in school? Was this a point of national pride, or, and when I say that, I think of, here to be pro-life is kind of like, yeah, you must hate women, and the status quo is to not be pro-life. It's to be pro-choice and to accept abortion, at least for a number of circumstances. But what was the status quo for you in Ireland and for people who were, I don't know, just being taught about the Eighth Amendment, about Irish history? What was it like?
So that's a very interesting question, because it goes back to what I said earlier about the fact that even though the people had voted for the Eighth Amendment, the establishment was against the Eighth Amendment. A lot of the political establishment, the media was absolutely against it. And of course, all of that starts to filter down then to what people hear about the Eighth Amendment. And it also filters down, as you say, into the schools. So I would say that between 1983 and 1992, so the first 9 or 10 years of the existence of the Eighth Amendment, it certainly was thought as a positive thing. And even though there was a lot of kickback from the media, a lot of aggression about it, it was evident, there was no evidence that it was impacting in any way negatively on medical care or everything like that. So while the media didn't like it, there wasn't a lot that they could say about it. And certainly, I think a majority of people were very supportive of it. Then in 1992, there was a very well-known case, you've probably heard of it internationally, called the X case, where a pregnant rape victim wanted to go to England to have an abortion. And that invoked issues then around the right to travel and the right to information and around the right, if you like, and around the abortion law itself. And it was, these cases have arisen in every country. And really, I think when you look at them, when you look at the pattern and the playbooks that are being kind of drafted around these very sad and difficult cases, you can see that the primary concern of those who use them as a battering ram against pro-life laws isn't with the rape victim. It isn't with the woman who is confused or fearful or frightened here, because there's never any interest in offering another solution or support you in any other way. It's simply like, okay, let's use this case to try to legalize abortion. So there certainly was a furore at the time. There was a lot of international attention. You had a lot of international criticism of Ireland. And there were marches, things like that. And that's when we founded Youth Defence, to kind of be a counter, to become, I suppose, the countercultural voice, because you certainly had the media saying, oh, look, people have changed, young people want change, students are out marching. And Youth Defence, if you like, we're countercultural in that we were speaking up against the media establishment and the political establishment in 1992, saying, no, the Eighth Amendment is a good thing. It protects this baby and every baby, and women deserve better than abortion, and we should continue to retain the right to life of unborn children in the Constitution. It probably didn't feel as countercultural as it became afterwards, because I think even with the X case and kind of, it was a sad and difficult situation, and it makes people question their values and question what they believe in, especially when they're only hearing one side of it all the time. But it was still, I suppose, if you like, the pro-life culture was still strong. It certainly diminished over the years, and it diminished because, like what you've just highlighted, Peter, after the media began to make, for example, to criticize schools for showing pro-life videos or having pro-life speakers in. That impacted on people who were going through schools then, because they weren't hearing that anymore. You had colleges, campuses becoming increasingly liberal places. Only they banned pro-life groups. They wouldn't let pro-life groups have stalls on campus or have speakers in. Like every time we brought Janet Jackson over to speak one time, and she ended up speaking last time in the lobby of the university because they cancelled the room at the last minute. It's this slow drip of kind of undermining the pro-life position, of relentlessly pushing one point of view in the media, in the schools, on campuses. Oh, of course, all of that had an effect. So by the time 2018 came around, did it feel more countercultural than it did in 1992 when we started Youth Defence? Yeah, of course it did. And I think that happens in every country where laws become more liberal. One of the things I always think about this, though, is that people are sheep, unfortunately. And it's more of a hallmark of the modern mind than it probably would have been of my parents' generation, when people were more independent-minded and were more able to think for themselves and to kind of assess an argument and say, well, that doesn't make sense to me. So sadly, and I know it's an unpopular thing to say, but people are sheep. And if pro-life was the trendy thing in the morning, they'll all be pro-life. Sadly, that's the truth of it. But abortion became, and repeal of the Eighth Amendment became a movement that was trendy and popular and progressive and pushed by the media and pushed by everybody in power. And people like to support causes that are trendy.
Mm-hmm. Jonathon, I want to throw a question to you, because so you're the author of the book Patriots that we're talking about today, the untold story of Ireland's pro-life movement. And not to pump your tires too much, but when I read this book and I read how the Eighth Amendment came to be, and a lot of what we've talked about so far, this reads like an epic novel where you see these rises of opposition that come in, and you say, like, oh no, it's gonna crack at this, the baby X case, like, oh no, that this is played out in other countries, and this is where another country fell, and this other case that came up and whatnot. As you were researching the story of Ireland, as you were researching the story of Ireland's pro-life movement, and how you had always kind of seen Ireland as the crown jewel within the pro-life movement of this nation, which could survive with abortion being prohibited in all cases, and yet maternal health is so wonderfully looked after, all that sort of thing. What was going through your mind as you were researching this, as you were learning more and more about Ireland's pro-life movement in this period of, I would say, even the late 70s, bringing about the Eighth Amendment into the 80s and into the early 90s, as Niamh mentioned, into 92, which is getting close to the emergence of youth defense and a more active defense of pro-life laws. What was it like kind of researching how a nation that was already pro-life, had enshrined this with an Eighth Amendment, was still on their toes, making sure that they were able to maintain this pro-life legislation, maintain a pro-life culture in many ways? What was it like kind of learning about this, and especially as you learned more and more about other countries which hadn't been as well prepared, hadn't been as effective in preventing abortion coming to their shores?
Well, there's three primary things that I took away from it. It reads like an epic novel because it really is an epic story. From start to finish, it has all of the ingredients of an epic story as well. And one of the most gratifying things for me of those who read and reviewed the book was that they said they felt reluctant to initially pick it up because they knew how the story ends, and then they were really, really glad they did because they realized that the story was such an incredible one. The first thing I think is really important about the story, just more generally speaking, and my colleagues at CCBR, of course, will already know this because I've forced endless amounts of information on this on you all, is the various strategic insights that we can get from it. I think the story is incredibly relevant because there's so much that our movement can learn. And I think that we don't spend enough time in our individual countries examining how movements in other countries do things, because there are plenty of things that are regionally specific, which is why showing up in another country and telling people how to run their movement is idiotic and arrogant, because they have a different cultural context. But there are always some things that I think are very transferable. The second thing is it's incredibly inspirational, because I had to ask myself, while I was researching the story and while I was in Ireland prior to the 8th, if I would have done what they did for all those years to make it happen. Right, I ran some numbers just after the vote in 2018, and the pro-life movement in Ireland saved roughly 5% of the existing population, and that's a low estimate. 5%, that's incredible. But why did they do that? It's because they put boots on the ground every day in a country where abortion was already illegal. Right, like many of you, I was motivated to join the pro-life movement by seeing a video of a baby being pulled apart and realizing this is happening in my city. It's happening, in the next city over. I can't believe this is actually going on. But I don't know if I would have gotten involved the way I did if I'd seen a video like that and just got to feel sort of smug that this was going on elsewhere, but we were safe because we had the right laws. And so I think that lesson all by itself is a real challenge for us to recognize that the pro-life movement, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And this is to build a culture of life, we have to be always building a culture of life, right? Like G.K. Chesterton said, if you want to have a white fence post, you must always be painting the fence post. And the same thing is true of a culture of life. And the Irish story really did teach me that. The third thing is something I've grown increasingly passionate about over the last 5 years. And it's as we realize around the world that the pro-life fight is a long fight, is it's so important that we tell the stories of our own heroes. Because what we're seeing is that the only people who tell the stories of the heroes of the pro-life and the pro-family movement are those who hate our guts, want to lie about us, and very frequently want to present a version of the story that's garbage and designed to further perpetrate the injustices and the corruption that they seek to integrate into our culture. So last year, for example, we saw a movie come out about Gloria Steinem in Hollywood, which was basically this, hagiography of Gloria Steinem, virgin and martyr, and it was just a total pile of steaming garbage from start to finish. And then a series about a Catholic housewife who wrote 92 books, after her 6 kids were in bed, and then ran a movement that single-handedly stopped the Equal Rights Amendment and prevented abortion from becoming mainstream in the Republican Party. She took on the establishment, and they created this mini-series about her. They waited till after she was dead because they were too scared of her, even when she was in her 90s, where, she was doing business with the Klan and she's a racist, she's this awful person, right? Well, that is what a generation of people are going to grow up thinking about Phyllis Schlafly. Because we've never written her story. We've never put out a documentary. The only biography of her, personal biography, was written, before the ERA was defeated by Carol Felsenthal, who's a liberal. And so right after the amendment the Eighth Amendment was repealed in Ireland, I remember reading all the news reports, and there was all this garbage about, the vanguard of the patriarchy had finally been vanquished, right? And Ireland could finally start to move into the sunlit day of infanticide. This was all over, right? The long night has passed, and here we are hugging in front of the castle where the British used to exercise their imperial rule. It was a really beautiful moment, but it didn't resemble reality in any way, shape, or form. And I thought, if we don't tell this story, and I think I'm probably slightly better equipped to tell the story only because I can be more honest about the Irish movement, because they won't actually admit how extraordinary what they accomplished was, and they would never write the things about themselves that I wrote about them. So I do think that you need a degree of separation to actually write the things that other people wouldn't. The same thing is true for Joe Scheidler, who actually asked Niamh about this later, does pop up in Niamh's life early on as well. The Washington Post eulogy for Joe Scheidler managed to, like they said, he never advocated violence, but he didn't seem that sad about it, right? Even when they couldn't find any garbage about him, they had to dredge up something. And so I think as we recognize that, in the next 40 years, we are going to have to work day in and day out. And one of the things we have to do is, if we want to explain to younger generations of people, thanks for that joke earlier, Peter, about why they should get involved, we're going to have to tell the stories of our own heroes.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to explain that if we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, it's because we stand on the shoulders of giants. And if we tell those stories well, maybe people are going to want to emulate them. Maybe they'll be inspired by them. Maybe you have somebody who wants to be the next Joe Scheidler, who wants to be the next John O'Reilly, who wants to be the next Niamh. We need those people to come up and do that work. But in order for that to happen, we need to tell those stories first.
I totally agree. And when Jonathon, first went to write the book, to be honest, at the time, I think everyone was so brokenhearted, nobody wanted to write a book at all. But he's 100% right. And, someone should make a documentary about Joe Scheidler. When I was young, Joe Scheidler came to stay in my family home. And I remember he was just such a giant of a man in every way, and so lovely and warm-hearted and powerful and inspirational, everything. And he left my mother, for my mother's use, photographs of aborted babies. And when I saw them a couple of years later, it shocked me to my core. And just like Johnson, it was one of the reasons why, when the X case happened in 1992, that even though my family was always involved in pro-life, it really spurred me to action, because that you don't get that image out of your head. That awful image of that little broken body that should never be happening. This should never happen, that women ever have to feel that this is the only answer that's out there for them, or that people put into law that it's legally permissible for you to do this to another human being. But you're right about telling our stories, and you're right about inspiring people that way, because what do people know about the pro-life movement, what they read in the media? And what Jonathon did, I suppose, was gather some of the stories and the facts and everything else that made the pro-life movement in Ireland. And remember when Jonathon, you were looking at some of the stuff, and Emmett Glynn, that cameraman, was looking at it too, and he said one of the things that he loved about Youth Defence, say between 92 and the next 10 years, there was very punk. I never thought Youth Defence was punk. So I was like, really? He said, yeah, you were just unafraid to do what needed to be done. So if there was a big political convention on and you wanted to interrupt it with a pro-life message, you just sailed on and then did it. And you took the flack and you took the media criticism for that. But boots on the ground as well. You are correct about that. A movement that doesn't have boots on the ground is not going to succeed. It doesn't matter how great you are at social media. It doesn't matter, how clever your messaging is. If you're not out there and you're not visible and kind of being seen to be part of the community, or being seen to be an active voice in your country, it's difficult to have a really powerful impact. And I think because so many people were involved in 1983, when we set up Youth Defence then in reaction to the X case in 92, there was a lot of people out there who were used to being activists. And then we were very activist focused. We wanted to get out there and do things and hold protests and make our voices heard and let people see what the reality of abortion was. So it just became part of the movement automatically. And it was the driving force behind everything that was done, I think, to keep abortion out of Ireland was this kind of commitment to the movement, this commitment to being active, this commitment to always putting the message out there, and to do what I think is often the most powerful thing of all, which is to meet people face to face, to show them the reality of abortion, and to talk to them about why it can never be the answer in a civilized society, about why there always has to be a better answer than this to a baby. And that was always part of what we did, often in the face, of severe opposition, of police arresting people because they were showing the reality of abortion, or police arresting people because they were protesting at a politician's clinic and stuff like that. But I think the movement persevered because the motivation is the same for all of us. The motivation is to protect those who are so vulnerable.
All right, this is a good transition, Niamh, into your story and some of the work that you did. Before that, for those of you who are listening, if you want to get your hands on Jonathon's book, Patriots, the Untold Story of Ireland's Pro-Life Movement, you can find it at thebridgehead.ca/shop. thebridgehead.ca/shop. Okay, Niamh, so you saw an image. Joe Scheidler came to your home. You saw the images of aborted children. You got involved in 1992. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And when I say that, I'm thinking of, there are a lot of people who see the images but don't end up doing anything. But you ended up doing something. We see the inception of Youth Defense, in which you were a significant part, working with other people. And part of this as well is one of the things that we hear in Canada when we're trying to get people to fight abortion is they're like, well, I can never get involved because, abortion is so far along that we're never going to change the tide anyway. And I can see the temptation in Ireland being the other way, being, well, abortion's legal. Why is it necessary for me to get involved? I think at the end of the day, people just don't want to get involved when they're giving some sort of excuse like that. But could you tell us a little bit about, you getting involved, the inception of Youth Defense, and the work that you guys did in mobilizing people to be active for the babies, even when you had the Eighth Amendment in place?
Well, sometimes, things arise because of timing. And, when we set up Youth Defense, we didn't have a grand plan or strategy or anything. We were set up in reaction to the X case and to that very immediate threat that we had to deal with straight away. And sometimes I think too, whether it's God's hand or otherwise, like, you get a group of people together who have all the ingredients that is required to really start an activist organization. And so I think both of those things, like, I suppose it was prompted by this immediate threat to having the Eighth Amendment overturned by the Supreme Court, and so that drew a lot of people out who were saying, okay, well, this is no longer, so this is even worse than what we might have imagined before 1983, because now it's real and it's on our doorsteps, and we have to fight back against it. So you had a lot of people, I think, who joined the movement because the X case happened. But then in Youth Defense, there just happened to be like a particular mix of people who had skills and I suppose courage, to be honest. You know what I mean? Because I can understand, Peter, why sometimes people think, this is not a fight for me, even if I'm opposed to abortion and very pro-life, because there is a lot of hate, directed at pro-life people from the establishment, who have the power in the media and elsewhere, and sometimes in the law to put down pro-life activists, or to try to restrict what they do, or to try to restrict their reach. So it isn't, I think, sometimes always the easiest battle in the world. But if you have the right team of people and who have those kind of skills and attitudes, and who have the right, I think, the right attitude in that they know why they are doing this. It's not to be a leader, or it's not to be an activist, or it's not, it's because you understand abortion is wrong, and that's what motivates you. When I saw those photographs, it was the cruelty and the injustice of it that motivated me. And that should always be your motivation, that you wanted to put an end to that cruelty and injustice, and you want to do better for women. And we had those kind of people in YD from the very beginning. And they probably were, to use Emmett Lynn's phrase, a bit punk, so they did things like, climbed up to the roof of a university building and dropped a 40-foot banner down the entire front of it because they wouldn't let us have a student table there, stuff like that I think people might not have imagined that the pro-life movement would do. So the focus was always to be active, to reach out to people, to keep the issue before people's minds, to make people understand, like, you need, first of all, this is the truth about abortion. Second of all, you need to be active in opposing it or it will come in through the back door. And third, that if you are part of the movement, you had to always kind of reach out and try to bring other people to the reality of abortion, to a better understanding of the issue. And then from that came, like, the strategies came then, like the putting together better messaging, organising roadshows, organising rallies, like becoming a national organisation with branches and thousands of members. That all came then, but it wasn't there at the beginning. At the beginning, it was a reaction to a court case, and it was more, I think, the fact that the people who joined were very committed to this cause and understood the need to be active. That kind of led it then to become a very successful organisation.
Okay, so Baby X has been mentioned a few times, this court case. Could you, or Jonathan, you can dive into this as well, but could you elaborate for our listeners, who is Baby X, and what was the strategy that abortion supporters were using with this baby?
So it was a case involving a young girl who was raped and had become pregnant, and that then led to the Supreme Court looking at the Eighth Amendment, the High Court and then the Supreme Court looking at the Eighth Amendment and saying that actually they were going to interpret it now as not being a complete ban on abortion, but in the case where a woman was suicidal after being raped, that gave her a right to have an abortion. So they no longer view the equal right to life of the mother and child as a ban on abortion, as complete ban on abortion, but something that could be interpreted differently. So between 1992 then, if you like, for the next, until 2012, you had other cases like that arising. For example, you had the C case where a 13-year-old girl was raped, and it was a particularly distressing and an awful case, and again brought to England for abortion. She was in the care of the state, and those cases were, used, I think, by abortion campaigners and by the media to try to build support for repealing the Eighth Amendment. But that sometimes didn't work out quite as they had planned. Right? For example, in the C case, the young woman at the centre of that case, when she became older, spoke out and said that actually she had never requested an abortion. And she said that she had been brought to England for that abortion without her consent and without her full knowledge, and that afterwards it caused her, to really suffer grievously and to endure, I suppose, not just abortion regret, but to endure the loss of a child that she had not requested and had not wanted. So she was an incredibly brave woman, to speak out like that. And I suppose what that did in effect, and our role in the pro-life movement was to amplify what she had said and try to bring that message to people, and to do that all of the time, to try with street sessions and road shows and campaigns and billboard campaigns and all of those things to try to get people to understand, no, actually, but you might have read this story in the Irish Times or heard it in RT, but there's another side to this, and here's a side that you hadn't heard, and this side is one that supports retaining the Eighth Amendment and that shows that abortion isn't the answer. And that, even though you had those cases, so like X and C, arising during that period of time, between 1992, 20 years, if you like, until 2012, you didn't have the public support tipping over into a strong push to repeal the Eighth Amendment until the death of Savita Halappanavar. Because you had this constant battle, so you had the media and the political establishment pushing against the Eighth all the time, and then you had pro-life groups working all of the time to reach out to people to say, that's not the full story, here's some more information, here's the truth about the reality of abortion, here's what it did in this case. And that it kept public opinion strong in pro-life.
There's a couple of things in relation to that are, I think, important currently as well. The first thing for listeners to really understand is that this is a classic strategy that has worked almost everywhere, which is that the abortion activists go trawling for corpses or tragic circumstances that they can use to basically incur public compassion and then utilize that compassion to create the public will to legislate on abortion. So in the United States, some of you might remember that Jane Roe of Roe v. Wade, they claimed that she had been raped, even though she had not, in order to ensure she was a more sympathetic plaintiff. In Ireland, you have the X case, the C case, and several other cases. In Argentina recently, if you want to know how deceitful the media is, you have an example of a woman who was raped and apparently denied an abortion that was making headlines everywhere. And what the articles didn't mention in almost every circumstance is that abortion was actually legal in the case of rape in Argentina, and that this had no bearing on the situation that was actually taking place. When I was researching the book, there was evidence in multiple books, including those by abortion activists, that they were looking for a case like this, reviewing hospital records, and actively attempting to find something. I think the one, and this will be my last point, the one really relevant point that people don't consider very often is that if these cases were common, the abortion activists wouldn't have to look for them, right? One of the reasons Ireland was such an offense to the pro-abortion West at large is because there wasn't women dying in back alleys with coat hangers. All of the things they warned us would take place if abortion was legalized didn't happen in Ireland. And as long as Ireland maintained the level of maternal health care that it had while also concurrently banning abortion, they were just this constant proof that everything the abortion activists were telling the rest of us was in fact a lie. There were not pregnant women killing themselves after sexual assault. Again, these are purely hypothetical circumstances that have never actually occurred, because if they had occurred, we would all have heard about them so many times that we wouldn't be able to count. They would have been on headlines everywhere. If a pregnant woman had ever killed herself in a country where abortion was illegal because of a sexual assault that she had endured, the New York Times would make it the front page, and we would never stop hearing about it. So the very fact that these things have not been reported on, despite the fact that abortion activists have spent decades searching for them, is evidence that these are merely hypotheticals being utilized to victimize preborn children.
Yeah, one of the things that came out about the C case afterwards was that the woman, that young rape victim, said precisely that. She said that she felt her case had been used by abortion campaigners. And she pointed out that her life became very difficult after the abortion, and that none of them were there to offer her support. None of them were there to offer her help. None of them wanted to know about her anymore once she had, if you like, fulfilled what they wanted her to do, which is to be brought to England for an abortion, which caused her so much hurt and harm. And it was a very important insight, I think, into how abortion campaigners really see women and how really see those difficult cases. That they are simply there to be exploited, to try to build public opinion in support of abortion, but they don't really have that kind of compassion and love and support for women in those difficult circumstances that you see all of the time in the pro-life movement. And I've pointed this out to people so often. Like, the pro-life movement is meant to be anti-women, but it's the pro-life movement who run the crisis pregnancy centres. It's the pro-life movement who genuinely want to offer women a better answer. All abortion campaigners want to offer them is abortion. They pretend it's a choice, but it's literally like, you can have an abortion. I don't want to know anything else. I don't want to know about any of the ways that I might help you. In her case, it was like, we don't want to know about you anymore now that the abortion is over and done with, even though her life is very difficult and even though she needed that help. And just one last point in relation to what Jonathon said there. When Julie Kay from the Centre for Reproductive Rights, who's a Planned Parenthood lawyer, if you like, and she said that Ireland was the jewel in the crown of the pro-life movement for two reasons. One was because we had this record of maternal mortality, just like what Jonathon says. You couldn't use the boogeyman anymore because Ireland had shown that, in fact, our maternal mortality was better than Britain's, was better than most countries in Europe, because we had excellent maternal health care while banning abortion. And the second reason, which was revealed when there was a WikiLeaks dump of the One Foundation documents, so the foundation that George Soros runs, and it showed that he had given a lot of money to abortion campaigners in Ireland, hundreds of thousands of euros, precisely because the One Foundation felt that the Open Foundation, felt that this was a Catholic country. And if you managed to legalize abortion, what was perceived as a very Catholic country, you could do the same in other Catholic countries in South America and elsewhere. So Ireland was very important to abortion campaigners internationally.
And I think that's so important to note of just how not only sinister, but how organized the pro-abortion machine is in trying to thrust abortion into every single corner of the earth to make sure that preborn children can be murdered. anywhere, and ripped apart in their mother's wombs. And one thing that I wanted to ask Niamh, so we can definitely dive further into the discussion with the encounters that you've had with the media and trying to correct and show light into these completely warped and twisted stories that we've talked about here. But maybe share a little bit about your interactions on the street level, because when I'm out on the street doing our pro-life outreach, our choice chain displays, talking to everyday Canadians about abortion, it's not uncommon that I bring up the example of Ireland, especially to show that, abortion was not necessary for good quality maternal health and things like that, and how important it is, and seeing people's eyes open when they realize that they've been lied to by the media, when they realize like, this wasn't actually what the story was, and this guy just provided evidence showing that this isn't what this was about. I'm sure that, as whether it's the Baby C case or the countless others that the media tried to bring up to show just how barbaric the pro-life laws were, what were interactions like on the street, talking to everyday Irish people about what was actually happening, what the Irish media was actually trying to achieve? Did you get that kind of revelation of, oh my goodness, I'm being lied to? Or were people so kind of plugged into the media that it was really, really hard work to get them to realize that they were being lied to ultimately?
Well, when you did things like street sessions, which we did for years, of course, you Defence and then Life Institute, and when we did door-to-door canvassing, which was a huge part of the campaign, right from 2016, really, up to 2018, until the vote in 2018, those person interactions are enormously important because you're talking to somebody face to face, eye to eye. You're having an actual genuine conversation with them, and you're answering the genuine questions that they have about things like pregnancy from rape, about things like the case of Savita Halappanavar. All of the questions that people have about what will happen if abortion is legalized, what will happen with the abortion rate, what does it mean for women, what does it mean for maternal health care, what's the reality in relation to the numbers of babies with Down syndrome who are aborted once abortion becomes legal. All of these pressing questions that people have. The difficulty we encountered was that when Savita Halappanavar died, even though 3 subsequent inquiries showed that she had in fact died of sepsis, and that the Eighth Amendment did not prevent the doctors from intervening to save her life. They just didn't realise she had sepsis. They didn't realise her life was in danger. That's a very important distinction. In other words, what I'm saying is that in her case, the doctors were perfectly free under the Eighth Amendment to intervene and to deliver her baby. And that was not considered an abortion. It was never considered, those kind of interventions were never considered an abortion, because the intention there, of course, to save the life of the mother. But they had missed Savita's sepsis. They had missed 13 opportunities to see that she had sepsis with spikes in temperature, white blood cell counts, everything like that. And it was one of those tragic cases that was immediately seized on by the Irish media. And they managed to establish this narrative in the minds of Irish people that Savita Halappanavar died because she couldn't get an abortion, that she died because of the Eighth Amendment. And in normal circumstances, it would have been the things like the canvass and the street sessions and the media debates and all of that helps to shine a light, to show the truth about those issues. It became extraordinarily difficult to do so in this case because the narrative that they were trying to establish, they had such power to do so with the media, and it became like a barrage of propaganda that became very difficult for people to overcome. And then something else happened, I think, to help embed that narrative was that where previously the doctors in Ireland had been overwhelmingly pro-life, you had some doctors who were politically motivated who started to speak out to say, well, the Eighth Amendment needs to go. If it wasn't for the Eighth Amendment, Savita Halappanavar would have had medical intervention, even though that wasn't true. They were the only medical voices that the media wanted to give any time to. So we had like appalling instances during the referendum campaign itself where, when the yes vote started to slip, the media just shut down pro-life doctors, pro-life nurses, eminent experts, the people who had been the chair of the Institute of Obstetrics and Gynecology. 4 of them came out and signed a letter saying, "Look, this is not correct. This is not this is not a true interpretation of medical practice. Like Savita was entitled to the care that she needed." the media just effectively shut down those voices and only concentrated on the voices of pro-abortion doctors. And that became very difficult to overcome, because really, if you're an ordinary voter and you have met John, me or Jonathan or any of you on the street, and you have been convinced and impressed by the arguments we put forward, but then you go back and you look on TV that evening and you only hear pro-abortion medical experts saying, no, the fact of the matter is the Eighth Amendment needs to go. It becomes a matter of who do you believe then, And it was very difficult for the truth about that case to be heard, especially around the time of the vote in the referendum.
All right, folks. That was part 1 of 2 of our conversation with Jonathon Van Maren, author of the book Patriots, the Untold Story of Ireland's Pro-Life Movement, and Niamh Uí Bhriain, central figure in that pro-life movement, co-founder of Youth Defence and longtime pro-life ambassador in Ireland. You heard me right. That is part 1 of 2. We were having such a great conversation with the two of them that we have decided to break this into 2 episodes. So tune in next week to learn more about the Save the Eighth campaign and more about how Ireland was successful in protecting over 250,000 lives from abortion through the Eighth Amendment. That said, a couple of end notes here to keep in mind. First of all, we are doing a giveaway of a signed copy of the book Patriots by Jonathon Van Maren. If you want to enter into that, then please go to one of the podcast catchers that allows you to leave a comment and a review. I know that some of them don't, but if you can head to one, maybe it's not your normal one, but maybe it's one that allows you to leave a comment and a rating, please do so. We'll get that just for confirmation. If you can snap a quick screenshot of it and send it along to us either at our email, which is email at prolifeguys.com. You can send it to us on any of the social media hubs that we're on, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, any number of other ones that we're there on. And that will get you a signed copy of the book Patriots by Jonathon Van Maren. 2 other things that I'll mention. As we said off the top, we are having our first Ask Me Anything, which is really an Ask Us Anything, on Friday, March 7th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, Friday, March 5th at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. If you want to be a part of that, if you want to bounce questions off of Peter and I, how would we respond to it? If somebody asked us this on the street, in your home, at the dinner table, or online, please do. To be a part of that, you have to be registered on our Patreon as a patron by Friday, February 26th. And so the time's running out on that. Please sign up. It can be at any level that you're able to do so. Patreon supporters enable us to continue to grow this podcast, get on incredible guests like you've seen in the last number of months, and we've got a ton more coming down the tube for you. And so please do check that out. The last thing I'll mention, many of you have heard over the various episodes that we've done about CCBR's summer internships. These programs equip people to be pro-life ambassadors, not only giving them the training, but also the experience and mentorship that they need to be leaders in Canada's pro-life movement and the pro-life movement around the world. If you want to be a part of our summer internship, we know that there's going to be some modifications this summer due to the COVID-19 pandemic and all the guidelines and restrictions and whatnot. However, we are still recruiting interns. We'd love to have you as a part of the team. And so check out the show notes for how to apply, and we hope to see you there. Again, look forward to seeing you next week as we continue the conversation with Jonathon and Niamh. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day, whatever time it is, wherever you're at. Thanks so much for tuning in.